Hello, I'm Carter Wilson, and this is my training video for some basics on Java. Start off with, I'm gonna explain what Java is. Because you're probably like, what is this, some coffee thing? No, Java is the most used programming language in most programming jobs. It's the most influential program, per se. Like, if you're gonna work somewhere, it's the number one. I mean, you get it. It's the big program if you want to use, and it's what we use in first for our programming. So I'm gonna explain some basics. Code in Java is organized and compiled into classes, which each have different functions and variables in them. I know this sounds confusing, but it'll get less confusing as we go on. Functions, variables, and classes are practically the main thing we're going over today. Yeah. Okay, Java is object oriented, which works best for the manipulation of objects compared to other types of languages. We're going to learn more about this in the next training. Today's going to be more the basics. Today we're going to go over setting up and manipulating variables and classes and some examples of how they work. So, first off, variables and classes. A class can mean many things, but in this case, let's just say it's an object. It's usually standard practice to order your classes in separate files, but you don't have to do that. Usually, all the files are inside the program, and each file can interact with each other in a sense. When you're setting up a class, you need to set it as private or public, which determines what other classes can view it. Same goes for variables and functions, of course. They're very similar in how they're set up, which makes it a lot easier to learn them. When it comes to making classes, you can totally put them all in the same file. You can even put classes inside classes, I'm pretty sure. Java's really, how do I say, easy to use and has tons of different options for you. There's 20 different ways to do one thing. Billion, infinite. When setting up a class, private or public, which I already went over, but I'm going to go over it again. So, we're going to go over this in a few slides, but private and public are two big things, and if you don't set it to one specifically, it usually defaults to private. Yeah. Classes are named using Pascal case, which is no spaces and the first letter of each word is capital, while variables use camel case, which is very similar except the first word isn't capitalized. This is just naming schemes. You don't have to follow them, but it's generally accepted and it makes it easier to know what you're talking about. So basic data types. When we're going over data types, it's very important you know what we're talking about. Data types are what each variable can be. A lot of programming consists of variables and their usage and manipulation. If you think of a variable, you'll probably start thinking of the basic data types, which are like numbers, like our integers and doubles. Yeah, some integers can be 0, -3, or even our team number 3653, as long as it's a whole number between, I think it's a very big number that you can go up to, and once you reach that, it goes down to the lowest of the low. It can be negative, and it can go very high. Doubles, on the other hand, are the same, except they also have decimals. They have the same exact range, which is from the maximum to the minimum, but they also have decimals, which is very useful for a lot of things. If you're using money, if you want to be exact on your measurements, most calculations, you want to use doubles. Then there's characters. Usually people don't think of characters, they think of strings, but characters are a primitive data type. And those are, think of anything on your keyboard. Each letter on your keyboard is a character, and strings are commonly used variables to represent these characters as an array. For example, think of a word dog. It's made up of 3 characters, and that each character is a character, and 3 of them makes up a string. Then there's booleans. Well, we're not going over strings, by the way. Not now, at least. We might go over them later if I go more into actual programs that we're going to be doing, but I mean, I don't think we use it a lot in robotics. You also have booleans, which are a very fundamental data type. They're true, they're false, or they don't exist. That's really all it is. It's very easy to understand. Now we're going to go over setting up a class. I know this looks like gobbledygook right now, but by the end of this, you'll be able to understand what most of this does. With the exception of this. This is something we'll go over later. So when you're setting up a class, you go, notice they are public and private. Each one has either public or private. Public are if it's public, think your neighbor's baking a pie and they put it out for the whole neighborhood. That would be a public pie. Or if they bake it in their own house, only the people in their house can eat the pie. That's a private pie. It's the same thing. Think of them as stuff that any part of the program can find, or just this little bit of program. For example, if we set this to private, only everything inside this class can access all the private variables inside the class. All of them are made with their prefixes first, then their type, and then their name. Notice here we got the type, name, and the prefix. Prefixes, even though you don't have to technically put them all the time, it's common practice to always put prefixes because it's easier to understand. Hold on, give me a second. Just gotta plug in my computer. It started dying. Sorry. When it comes to classes, making classes, you have to type. It's very similar. All three of these are similar. We got this is a class, by the way. And when you're making it, you start with public. You usually want your classes to be public unless in a rare case scenario that you have a class inside of a class and you only want that class to access that class, which sounds like gobbledygook again, but trust me, it's not as hard as it sounds. Then you have your class. Every class is always going to have class as its thing. And then you have test class. Now, that's the name. Notice, because it's a class, we are using Pascal case. But all these are using camel case, which is lower letter, and if there's another word, capital letter. Same here. This is a variable. Yeah. After that, you put in the brackets, and this is all the code that the class has inside it. All this code here, from private to that last bracket before the final bracket that ends the class, that is all in test class. Don't worry about a semicolon. Usually you put a semicolon to end lines, but one way the computer sees it as public class, test class, all of this is in one line of it, right? And then it ends, and that's the end of the line. The semicolon ends the line for you. Basically, think in one line of code you got multiple lines of code. It's kind of like that. Setting up variables are the easiest of these three. So we got a private variable here, which means only these two functions can access it. What does that mean exactly? It means if I wanted to check if it was activated, I would have to use a public function to get it, and I'll go over that in a minute. But to make a variable, you want to set the type you want. For this example, we're using Boolean, which is represented by BOOL. But you could also use integers, which is INT, doubles, which is spelled as it looks, and characters, which are spelled CHAR. But we're just going to use bool for this example. Later, I'll have one with int, but for now, this is bool. You can only access it inside this class, and yeah, it's pretty basic, not too advanced, and it can be changed around in this. Because the variable is Boolean, when you create it, you don't have to assign it because it's going to be, by default, assigned to false. But if you wanted to assign it, after you assign it, you could put activated equals true, and then end the line with a semicolon, and that would make it equal to true. Or, oh wait, no, that's the same thing. I meant to put false here, ignore that. Private Boolean activated equal to true, which you're taking the two lines. This one is called the declaration line, which declares it and creates it in the computer for it to remember. And this is called an assignment line, which is taking that thing the computer remembers and giving it a value. You can combine it so that it creates it and gives it a value at the same time, which is much easier in many cases. Setting up functions. Functions are probably not as hard as classes when it comes to understanding, but they're a little bit harder than variables. Now, functions are made almost exactly like a variable, if you see. They just got this little thing at the end, which is, it could take stuff in, by the way. If you put words in there, like very specific words, which you'll see on the homework, but you don't have to worry about it because I wrote it in for you. But this is the stuff that it takes in, it's called input, right? This is the input, and it gives out an output. Think of it like a machine. You throw in one number, you get out another. Now, both of these this machine doesn't take an input, it just gives an output. So you see public bool, which means it's going to spit out a bool out of it like a machine. Get activated, notice these parentheses are empty, which means it doesn't take an input. If there was an input, you would put it in there with the type followed by the name. And then in the brackets, we have the stuff inside that code, similar to the class. And it's going to, because this is it's going to keep going until it returns a Boolean. And if it doesn't return a Boolean, then you're going to crash because it's supposed to return a Boolean. It's not going to start up because it has to. Yeah, this one's pretty simple. This is called a getter function or a get function, which is extremely simple. You get public, same thing. Notice it's a copy of this, except it's public. It says get activated, and instead of activated has that, return activated. This is so private bool activated. Activated isn't going to be able to be changed from outside the test class, but you can still access it so you can know what it's at, what the value is, true or false. Public void toggle. Now void, what is that? How do you return void? Well, basically what this means is you're not returning anything. You're going to return void. It's very simple, but it just means we're going to run through all this code when it's called. Now, when I say when it's called, we'll go over that more next time, but think of it like we're running the machine. We're going to click the button that says go, and if it needs an input, we put the input at the same time we press go. But there isn't an input here, so don't worry about it. So we're hitting that go button. The toggle's going to do all this stuff, but it's not going to spit anything out because it's void. Rather, it's just going to mess with the inner workings of this factory and change the Boolean activated to be the opposite of what it is. Notice if activated is true, this basically means is. This means set it equal to, and that's the difference between 1 and 2 equal signs. If activated is true, it's going to run this code, which sets it to false, and if it's not equal to true, it's going to set it to true. So that's just going to toggle it, which is exactly what the name is, and both of these functions are public, which means while you can't access this variable from outside test class, you can definitely access these from outside test class, which is very nice, very nice. Now, variable manipulation and assignments are simple. When working with variables, you can change them over time through the code. That's what makes variables very useful. The lines of code that do this are called assignments. They can add, subtract, multiply, or divide variables with some simple equations like math. As you see in this one, you got it declaring x, so now x is stored in the computer. It doesn't have a value yet, right now it's null, but then we set x to be equal to 3. Now x has a value to it, but let's not keep 3, let's change that value to be 2 times 5, which would be 10. And then we're going to say, let's set x to be x minus 4. Whoa, how does that work? That is not correct mathematically. Well, it doesn't need to be. This isn't math class. This isn't a function that doesn't make sense, because rather than it being something where it's always true, we're setting it to be equal to it. So don't think of it like in math. Think of it like we're setting it to be this minus this. So x, right now it's 10, but ignore that. We're going to set it to be something new. What's that new thing going to be? It's going to be 10 minus 4, which is 6. So at the end of this, x is going to be equal to 6. Here, this is a very simpler version of it, which uses some shortcuts. First off, we're combining declaration and assignment. I showed you that over here, how you can combine it, but this is combining an integer, which is slightly different, but it's practically the same. Then we're also still setting it to be 10, which is 2 times 5. And then this might look confusing, but x equals x minus 4, that's a very annoying to read code. Rather, we have shortcuts. X minus equals 4 is going to take x, subtract it by 4, and set it equal to that. So this is going to do the same exact thing as this. These two codes do the same exact thing, except one's 3 lines and shorter, one's a bit chunkier. You want the shorter one, trust me. And it's less lines of code. It's easier to understand by the computer. Yeah. So, yeah. You could also do x plus equals y, x times equals y, or even x divided by equals y, which is a little bit of a rabbit hole, because if this is an integer, we don't really want to divide it, which is a complicated thing, but I think when it comes to robotics, we're mostly going to be using doubles. This integer thing is just to explain this. You could definitely replace integer with double and it would work the same. Doubles just have more range to them, which is their decimal points. They can represent decimal points, which is very important. Lets you get those minute details. Now, comments. This is going to be the last slide before we go over what I have set for homework, pretty much. So, for comments, programming can be hard to understand when you aren't the one who wrote it, so comments can be used to explain it. Comments are extremely useful when you work in a team. This is very important, because some teams might have one programmer who can get away with having all this code that's hard to understand, and nobody could understand it but him. But if we have multiple people coding, we want them all to be able to understand it. So we have comments. Comments can explain stuff very easily. What we do is we take 2 slashes, and everything on that line doesn't matter. The program will skip whatever is there and pretend it doesn't even exist, no matter what you put there. So, yeah, it's pretty nice. If you were looking at this, let's say we didn't have these comments here. Public int equals public int x is equal to 2048, plus equals 2, times equals 10, divided equals 10, minus equals 10. What does that all mean? Well, we know on the comment. It doesn't do anything, so feel free to ignore it. You don't have to worry about this. This isn't going to mess with your code, because it's just going to leave it the same. Yeah. That's really a dumb way to use the code, but hey, it's an example of comment. Now, for homework, let's make a class. So, as we saw over here, this is a class over here, this one, test class, and we've got all this nice stuff in it. Now, we're going to make our own class. Let's make a calculator. With this calculator, we're going to be able to make some calculator objects, which we don't know much about, but that's what we're doing next class. So make sure you have this by the next training, and we're going to use it to make some objects. The calculator will have a function that takes 2 doubles and adds them together. So if you remember the functions, these are the functions. They're like those machines that you put variables in, you get variables out, etc., etc., or you might get nothing out and you're just making the machine do stuff in the factory. It's pretty simple. Each object will count the amount of times that it's used in a private variable. This might not. You can ignore the object part because objects are confusing, but think of it like the class itself has its own instance of code and it's gonna remember stuff. So that's its memory. So it's gonna remember that each time you use it, it's gonna add to that number of how many times it's been used. And there will also be a function that returns the amount of times it was used, which is very simple. As we saw here, we got a getter. It's going to be almost the exact same thing. On the next page, there is a template you can use to make this class. Follow the instructions written in the comments, and it should be a piece of cake. It's extremely simple. It's not going to take too long. If you know what you're doing, it'll probably take you like less than a minute. If you don't know what you're doing, it might take like 5 minutes. I don't know. But if you need to contact me for help, feel free to. If you really feel like it, you can challenge yourself and also add a subtract and multiply function. Now, the reason I'm saying this is okay is because all you do is copy this, but instead of add, you set the name to be subtract, and instead of adding, you're going to subtract. It's pretty simple. So here we got the code. Just want to say, if you don't have a software like VS Code to edit it on, you could also use Notepad. The only exception is instead of using the tab key, you're just going to use 3 spaces. So let's look at this class template I'm going to give you. It can be found here, https equals //pagebin.com 5xenfyka. I'll say it again, 5xenfyka. Don't know if capitals matter. They probably do, but yeah. Public class calculator. This is the class. You're going to work inside it. Ignore anything outside the class. I don't want you doing anything outside these 2 brackets. Now first, we got private int times used, and I want it to be set by default to 0. So that means I don't think you want to set an assignment, but you can, sure. You could make an assignment here that sets it to 0, or you can combine them into one line, which I think would be cooler. Then we have I've set up this class already, which is the function, set up this function, the add function, which takes in a double, which is number 1, and a double, which is number 2. Now this looks confusing. I'm going to go over this right now. So what this means is it's going to create a variable called number 1 that's private to this code only. So you can only use it here, but this is the inputs. These are your things you're sticking in the machine, and you're going to be able to use them to get the result. Now, private double result, this is going to be the result. And then you want to set it to be equal to number 1 plus number 2, because you're adding number 1 and number 2. These are variables. Treat them just like you would result itself. You don't have to mess with these. Don't change these. Just set result to be number 1 equal number 2. Always remember the semicolons. If you don't put semicolons at the end, it won't work. Then you want to take times used and add 1 to it. You could do this with, you could take times used is equal to times used plus 1. You could set times used plus equals 1, or you could even use times used plus plus, which we haven't gone over, but if you know enough programming, feel free. And then it's going to return that result. And then, now this might be confusing, but we went over it earlier. It shouldn't be too hard. Now, make a public get function called times used that will return the integer times used. If you need help, look at the get function on 5 to 7, because the structure is almost identical. 5 to 7 is this page to this page, but if you look at this, it's extremely simple. It's public, the type get activated, which in this case would be get times used, 2 parentheses, semicolon, semicolon, return times used. That's really all you're doing. I'm giving this to you. It's not hard. I just want to make sure you know what you're doing. And that's about it.